part number 118 in our series called The Perfect Person of God. We are moving through our study in Matthew's Gospel at a little bit of a higher clip recently, more verses. But before we're going to get into the burial portion of Jesus' death before his resurrection. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about something that Matthew utilizes throughout the gospel. And this is a motif of contrasting characters. Now, we're not going to go through all of them, but one of the things that Matthew does, one of the literary devices that he uses, is to contrast certain people that surround Jesus with other people who surround Jesus. For example, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, it's at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. There's a brief parenthetical statement. After Jesus has made this grand teaching, it says that the crowds marveled at him because Jesus taught as one who had authority. And then it makes an additional statement, a dig at the religious leaders. It says, unlike the scribes and the Pharisees. So there's this presentation of the scribes and the Pharisees. And then immediately in Matthew chapter 8, we get the healing ministry of Jesus. So you have this compact teaching of Jesus in Matthew 5 through Matthew 7, we call the Sermon on the Mount. And then beginning in Matthew 8, you have the beginning of Jesus' healing ministry. Now, Jesus had already been healing. Matthew chapter 4 talks about that, but Matthew 8 is where we start to actually see specific examples. And who is the first person that Jesus heals in Matthew 8? This is probably in lesson 28 of, what is it? Close, very close. That's number 2. That's the second one. A leper. It's the leper. So what do we know about lepers? They are ceremonially unclean. Do the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, do they want to have anything to do with lepers? No. So what you get is you get this contrast with the way Jesus is teaching, which Matthew describes as being with authority, unlike the religious leaders. And then you see Jesus doing what the religious leaders definitely wouldn't do, which is coming in contact with someone who's ceremonially unclean. That leads right into the second healing in Matthew chapter 8, which is the centurion's servant. So not only a Gentile, but a Gentile's servant. And then you get a very brief statement where Jesus is healing a woman, Peter's mother-in-law. So all three of those characters that Jesus heals are outside the realm of kind of religious cleanliness or ceremonial cleanliness. Then you get to the end of Matthew chapter, you get later on in Matthew chapter 8, and there's this commitment, this ill-formed commitment by a scribe in Matthew chapter 8, verse 19. So skip back to Matthew 8, verse 19 for just a moment and see this very, very brief kind of statement about someone who looks like a religious leader, wants to follow Jesus, but it's ill-informed. A scribe, it says, came up and said to him, that's Jesus, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Now, what's just happened is Jesus has healed all these people that a scribe would definitely not go to, and now they're saying, "I'll follow you wherever you go." And then Jesus says, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." So he's like, look, scribe, if you think kind of following me is going to advance your religious career, you're wrong. You're wrong. And then the very next statement is about someone who's called a disciple, who also makes an ill-formed commitment, and yet by the description of him being a disciple, demonstrates that this person learns from Jesus and then ultimately follows, rather than the scribe who hears from Jesus and doesn't follow. That's the implication there, right? Jeff, did you have a question? Yes, leprosy is contagious. Now, I will say this. Just because you're Just because our English translations say leprosy, it doesn't mean the same kind of leprosy that we often think of. Because any skin disease was considered leprosy. So if you look, there's usually a parenthetical note in your English translations where it says leper, and it will say something to the effect of, this word was used to designate numerous forms of skin disease. So if you had a kid that had really bad acne, they would have said he has leprosy. Eczema, leprosy. So if you have eczema, back then they would have said leprosy. Now there is leprosy, but like what we would think of leprosy, where parts of your skin are just kind of falling off. But it's not always what they're talking about. But they considered all forms of skin disease leprosy and unclean. Now there was a lot of that because any kind of skin disease, if left untreated, will get much worse. Will get much, much worse. And it will create all sorts of additional problems. If you've had, no, it's too much information. I'm not going to tell you that. But if you've had even untreated acne, if it goes and goes and goes, that can create a myriad of problems for a teenager. If you went through that, or if you had a child or grandchild who went through that, it can be very serious. We don't think of it as being very serious because there are treatments. But back then, they didn't have acne to the same level that we have it today. Why? Greasy food. I mean, I'm joking, but not really. I mean, it really does make a difference. But they did have other skin diseases because they didn't have access to different types of vitamins and things like that, soaps and things like that. If you look throughout Matthew does this. Matthew puts these narratives together where people who are on the religious outside or on the outside entirely from ethnic Judaism or religious Judaism, puts them right next to people who are right smack dab in the middle of the religious elite. And in every single case, until we get to the Passion, we see the religious elite falling away from Jesus and those who are on the religious and social outside moving towards Jesus. Another great example is Matthew chapter 15. So flip on over to Matthew chapter 15. This actually represents a series of contrasts. The Pharisees and the scribes begin to question Jesus about his breaking of traditions and different commandments. And then Jesus kind of kicks back to them about their breaking of their own traditions and commandments. And then he calls the people together and he says, hear and understand, this is verse 10 and 11, hear and understand, it's what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person. Then the disciples came and said, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? Now, the answer, obviously, is Jesus knows what he's doing. He's trying to be offensive. Not trying to be offensive for the sake of being offensive, but he's trying to get under the skin of the religious leaders and the Pharisees. So you get this back and forth about tradition, about cleanliness. And then in verse 21, what is the very next scene? What's the very next scene? It's a Canaanite woman. So it's not just a Gentile, it's a Canaanite woman. Now, what do we know about the area of Canaan and the people of Canaan? Traditionally, good or bad in the scriptures? Bad, right? Where is the promised land? Canaan. Who are the people that are living in Canaan when Moses and Joshua come out of Egypt and they head to the promised land? Who's living there? The Canaanites. And God kicks the Canaanites out, not just because people say, oh, well, it's so mean and so terrible that God is kicking the people out of their own land. No. If you read back in the book of Genesis, he waits 400 years. He waits 40 generations before he does that because there are sinful people. There are sinful people that offer human sacrifices to their gods. They're warmongering. They consistently push aside those who are less than and marginalized, and God is coming in to purify that land with the people of Israel. That's the goal. That's the hope. Now, obviously, the Israelites don't do a very good job, but the idea is that that's who the Canaanites are. And Matthew makes a point of not just calling this woman a Gentile, but a Canaanite. To carry, because remember, Matthew is always going back to the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, promises and prophecies to demonstrate how Jesus fulfills and completes that Old Covenant promise and prophecy. But the way he's doing it, the way Jesus does it, is not through war and not through armies, it's through healing. And what the Pharisees and the scribes are worried about is looking clean, not actually being clean. And Jesus is interested in making someone clean, even those who are on the outside. And she recognizes that this is the Lord, the Son of David. Not just a teacher. Jesus is a teacher, but not only a teacher, but he's more than that. And so you get these kind of studies in contrast. You see more healings. You see more kind of clashes with the Pharisees and the religious leaders. So one of the questions becomes, why does Matthew organize his gospel in this way? Because if he's trying to make a case for Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, what do the contrasts accomplish? What do the contrasts with the religious leaders accomplish if Matthew's trying to say he's the Jewish Messiah, but only the non-Jews or the Jewish people who are on the margins, the ceremonially unclean, only they recognize him? Well, what Matthew's trying to do is to say to those who would try to kind of lean into the religious elitism is, you miss the point. You miss the point of the Old Covenant. You miss the point of the promises. You miss the point of the prophecies. And so even when we get into the Passion, one of the reasons that we see Matthew put the trial of the religious leaders and the Sanhedrin right next to Pilate is to show that who recognizes Jesus as the King of the Jews? Pilate. Now, again, I've said this many times, I'm going to say it again. Don't let Pilate off the hook. He's still a coward. He's still a political, kind of entity trying to make his way up the political ladder. But he does make the recognition that Jesus is the King of the Jews. Now, does he care that Jesus is the King of the Jews? No. But the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all those in the Sanhedrin, they're not willing to acknowledge Jesus as the King of the Jews, but Pilate is. And even at the foot of the cross, if you look back in chapter 27, look at verse No.
Don't you think Pilate was more mocking him rather than Pilate actually believed that he was king of the Jews?
I don't think Pilate cared that he was king of the Jews, but he wasn't mocking him.
You don't think he was mocking him?
No, he was mocking the religious leaders. He was mocking the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. That's why he wrote. That's why he said what. That's why he proclaims when the religious leaders say, "Don't say he's the king of the Jews. Say he said he was the king of the Jews." And Pilate says to them, "What I've written, I've written," because he's really at odds with them as well. But it's still out of the mouth of a Gentile is coming the truth, whereas out of the Pharisees is coming nothing but lies. If you look at verse 439, this is right after this moment. It says, "And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, 'You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross.' So also the chief priests with the scribes and the elders mocked him, saying, 'He He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel, let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God, let God deliver him now, if he desires him, for he said, I am the Son of God. So you get that coming right out of the mouths of the chief priests and the religious leaders. And then you scroll down, or go down to verse 54. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, truly, this is the Son of God. So, in the mouth of the Gentiles is the truth. Now, do they fully believe the truth? Do they fully recognize it? Does Pilate? I don't believe Pilate cares. But he's still speaking the truth. The centurion, does the centurion fully understand what he's saying when he says this man is the Son of God? No, but he's still speaking the truth. Whereas the religious leaders and the chief priests, they are continually mocking Jesus. And so we get this continual study in contrasts over and over and over again. Last week we left off with that centurion, and this week we want to pick up with verse 55. It says, in addition to the centurion, there were also many women there, looking on from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So, you have the religious leaders coming and mocking Jesus. You have the robbers or those who were crucified with Jesus also mocking him. We know that it was only one of the two, but not both, the insurrectionists. And now we're at the foot of the cross, and there are the women. This is the first mention of the women that followed Jesus all the way from Galilee. And this is in keeping with Matthew's overall structure to counterbalance the testimony of the Gentiles with that of the religious leaders. We see this all the way in Matthew chapter 2, where you've got the Magi counterbalanced with King Herod. And this then is added to by Matthew with the listing of the names of the women at the cross. Now notice what he says. Does he say these are all the women at the cross? Because how does he describe the number of women that are at the cross? The word is many. How many does he list? 3. He only lists 3. Is that many? No, probably not. A few, right? But he does make a specific mention of 3. So, all of the synoptics, or all the Gospels list some women, and this is a kind of a comparison between Matthew, Mark, and John. So, of the women that are both at the cross or at the empty tomb. And we believe that list kind of corresponds with one another. So, who are these women who are at the cross? Now, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, right here, mother of Zebedee's sons, who are they? James and John. We know that because we know through looking at all the Gospels that James and John were called the sons of Zebedee. So there is a mother of the sons of Zebedee. Now, some people, and I kind of tend to be in this camp, they actually associate that mother of the sons of Zebedee with Salome. That's the same person. Mark actually names her Salome. Matthew just says she's the mother of the sons of Zebedee. That's one option. Now, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, or Joses, depending on how you read it in the Greek, this one gets really, really interesting because if you compare and contrast the listing of the Marys in the Gospels, one of the conclusions you make is that Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Because who's not listed explicitly anywhere? The mother of Jesus. Now, there's a lot of possible reasons for that, but we know she was there. How do we know she was there, Marilyn? Because we know Jesus looked at Mary and looked at John the beloved, and said, "Mother, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." So we know she was there. So the best estimation we have is that Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, who disagrees with this? Not in this room, but historically, there is a group that disagrees with this. Who? Catholics. Why? The doctrine of perpetual virginity. She only had one child, and that's Jesus. She didn't have any other kids. Now, we Protestants who actually read our Bible, no offense to you former Catholics, but you're a former Catholic for a reason, you're not a current Catholic, is because we know that Jesus had brothers and sisters. Why? The Bible tells me so, right? So it's not a stretch to say that Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Except the question becomes, why is she described as Mary, the mother of James and Joseph? Okay, so there's a couple of possible reasons for that. One is theological. Matthew might be elevating the point that that Jesus' status as her son is less important than his status as the Son of God. I don't necessarily buy that, but what I do buy is more of a historical reason. Because who becomes one of the key members of the early church? James. Now, this is a different James than James, the son of Zebedee. This is a different James. But in the book of Acts, because James, the son of Zebedee, is actually one of the very first martyrs. He doesn't make it past Acts chapter 5. But there is another James who does make it past Acts chapter 5. Somebody check me out on when James dies. I think it's Acts 5. He's the first martyr of the church. Pretty sure that's right. Could be wrong, because this is not a study in Acts. This is a study in Matthew. This James becomes the bishop of the church in Jerusalem. When I say bishop, I don't mean that in the Catholic sense. I mean he becomes the elder overseeing the whole church in Jerusalem. How do we know that? Well, in Acts chapter 15, now this I do know. Acts chapter 15, when the church is having a big debate about the inclusion of Gentiles in the church and what do they have to do to become part of the church, do they have to be circumcised? James is the one who steps up as the vocal leader, kind of calling balls and strikes about who can talk and who can't talk, and he is considered the leader of the church. Paul actually mentions James as well in some of his later letters at how James helped Paul gain credibility because of James' testimony about Paul. So one of the historic reasons that Matthew might be listing Mary as the mother of James and Joseph is because, guess what? James is still alive, and you can go check it out. Not now, but back then in the book of Acts, you could go and cross-check Matthew's testimony. Because Matthew says Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, at this point are not believers. They don't become believers till after the resurrection. But when they become believers, James and Joseph go back to their mother and they can confirm what they saw. Now, if that's the case, then Jesus' mother and Mary Magdalene appear on all the lists in the book of Matthew. And that, if you look again at comparing all of these things, that would make Salome Jesus' mother's sister, otherwise known as Jesus' aunt. Which means if Salome is the mother of the sons of Zebedee, what are James and John to Jesus? Cousins. And this makes sense. Because Galilee is a tight-knit community. And it's like Polk County. Everybody's related to everybody else. If you don't believe me, you should just come to one of the memorial services that I have and when you get old Lakeland together, oh yeah, I know this person, this person, this person, this person, this person, this person, this person. Yeah, if you're here longer than 10 or 15 years, you start to know people that know other people, and you pretty much know everybody. That's how it is. Yeah, Carol.
James, the brother of Jesus, the author of James in the Bible?
Our best guess is yes, correct. James, the author of the book of James, is the brother of Jesus. And Jude is also, we believe, the brother of Jesus. Are we 100% sure about that? No. Are we sure enough to be able to say that with some sense of authority? No. But is it a very good estimation? Yes. Is your salvation at stake if you don't believe that? No. None of this, by the way, I mean, these are the lists, and none of this is 100% certain. None of this is 100% certain. But it would help explain all of the lists together, and especially as you get into the resurrection in Matthew 20, or in some of the other passages where you see these connections. Some people suppose that Mary, the wife of Clopas, is the mother of James and Joseph, and not Jesus' half-brother. They like this one and this one are the same, not this one and this one. That's why there's some uncertainty. But the fact is that all the Gospels list who they list for specific reasons. And part of the reason that these are listed is because of what is said in verse 55. They had followed Jesus all the way from Galilee, ministering to him. They're not now, some people read this as they're only ministering to Jesus at the foot of the cross, and that's not what they're talking about. These women had been ministering to Jesus since the time of the beginning of his ministry in Galilee. There are other spots where you can actually see some of those those statements that they were financially helping to support the ministry. They were providing places of respite and places of care for the ministry overall as well. So if you look at all the Gospels, you can see them popping up at various times. Any other questions about that? These kind of, and I encourage you, this is one of those things where you can look on the internet and just kind of go down the rabbit trail and see what all the debates are. If it's Catholic, they're wrong. I'm just going to tell you right now, because they don't believe that Jesus had any brothers and sisters or half brothers and sisters. But some of the other kind of theories are pretty interesting about who is related to who and who was there and at what point. It's kind of interesting kind of fodder for your afternoon. It's where she was from. Yeah, Magdala. Yeah, Magdala. Yeah, it's like a lot of the names. It's not like the names we have now. It's typically, even the names that we carry with us, they're related to either a place or an occupation or the child of. So, for example, if are there any other Micks in here? I don't mean that negatively. I mean actual, like my last name is Mick Gowan, right? So you guys know what Mick, M-C or M-A-C means, right? Son of, correct, right? So somewhere along the way in my family tree, there's a person named Gowen, but actually what we know is that, this is funny, my family owes its history to florists, because Gowen means the son of the flower bearer. That's why on my coat of arms, if you go and visit my office, my coat of arms has a flower on it, sitting in the top, just a little pathetic little sunflower. That's the Scottish version. I mean, the Irish version is a little more manly. There's actually like a sword but I'm not Irish, so Scottish. But that's where the names come from. Or it'll be like, the names come from. That's why there's so many Smiths, because it's blacksmith, silversmith, goldsmith. They just dropped all that before, right? They came over to the United States. They dropped whatever the first part of it was. So it's occupation or location. Like James, sons of Zebedee, it would be Bar Zebedee. That's their father's name. Or Peter. What's Peter's last name? Anybody know? His name is Simon Bar Jonah. Simon Bar Jonah. His dad's name was Jonah or John. Interesting. And the same, Mary's from Magdala, so she become Mary the Magdalene. Mary the Magdalene. Speaking of last names, we're introduced to another character in verse 57. Verse 57, it says, "When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph." Joseph of Arimethea. Who was also a disciple of Jesus. And he went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut out in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the tomb. So Joseph of Arimathea is an interesting character in the Gospels. Luke chapter 23, verse 50 tells us a little bit more about Joseph. It describes him as a council member who explicitly did not consent to the actions that were taking place that ultimately resulted in Jesus' crucifixion. He's also described as someone who is looking forward to the kingdom of God. Luke describes him as a good and righteous man. John, let me write that down so you guys can cross-check me. Luke 23, verse 50. Sorry, my pen got messed up. And then following that. And then John chapter 19, verse 38 and following, tells us that Joseph was a follower, but makes it very clear that Joseph of Arimathea was a follower, but in secret. In secret, out of fear. He was secretly a follower out of fear. Now, this always begs the question, can you be a secret follower of Jesus? Is that possible? Well, it was at least possible then. And Mark mentions that it was this scene. When Mark talks about Joseph, it's this scene of Jesus' crucifixion that prompted Joseph to come out of hiding as a follower and to take courage. Because as soon as he lays claim to the body, everybody knows he's a follower. Because if Jesus is accused of and is crucified for being a blasphemer, then the religious elite would have nothing to do with him. Now, Joseph of Arimathea is in that religious elite, but he's laying claim to the body of a blasphemer and allows him to be buried, not allowed to, but actually asks permission for Jesus to be buried in his own tomb, defiling his own tomb. John also tells us that there is another member of the religious elite with Joseph of Arimathea. Who's that? Anyone want to take a guess? Nicodemus. John's the only person that mentions Nicodemus. He mentions him in John chapter 3 and then at the end in John chapter 19 as well. Now, Matthew is not explicit, but the background of the scene, and one of the reasons that it is attested to in all four Gospels, this particular scene, Joseph of Arimathea, it's attested to in all four Gospels, it's because it goes back to the book of Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 53. Remember, a few weeks ago, we talked about how Matthew throughout his gospel, he's used that fulfillment formula motif. This was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Well, when we get to the Passion, he abandons that motif, but still adds detail to allude to things that happened in the Old Testament, specifically in the book of Psalm chapter 22, and Isaiah chapter 53. In this case, Isaiah chapter 53, verse 9, if you want to read that, it talks to us about the grave. What does it say? It says this. It says, "And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth." That's Isaiah 53:9. So Matthew makes this very explicit that Joseph of Arimathea is the rich man. He is the one who gives Jesus the grave to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Joseph is wealthy and influential. And that's important. Why would that be important in this scene? Because who does he have to get the body from? Who owns the body of Jesus? Pilate does. The Romans do. And who's getting an audience with Pilate? Why? Why not Mary Magdalene? Because he's rich and influential. Yeah, Kay. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a really interesting point, that it does put all of the activity on Joseph of Arimathea and no one else. It doesn't say he had servants do this. It's likely that he might have had. I mean, listen, he had to. He's wealthy, he's influential, but he's also not a spring chicken, right? And Jesus' body is not light. Think 145 to 175 pounds. He's probably not doing it totally by himself. And we also know Nicodemus is there. But it is interesting that Matthew does put all of the responsibility on Joseph's shoulders, even though he is wealthy and influential. He needs that wealth and he needs that influence in order to gain an audience with Pilate. Now, the other side of this is that it was customary for followers or friends of the executed to claim the body. Otherwise, what would happen to the bodies? Could be eaten by the birds, or they could be thrown into mass graves. One of those two things would have happened. They'd just leave them up there until the carrion birds come and take them, or they're thrown into mass graves. Depends on how quickly they need the crosses again for another execution. It really does depend on how quickly they need them. But it was important for Joseph of Arimathea, for Nicodemus, and for the followers of Jesus who were there, Mary Magdalene and the other Marys, that Jesus comes down. Because, again, we've talked about this before in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22 and 23. I'm running out of space here. It says, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." And especially this is important as the Sabbath approaches. And so Joseph would have worked very quickly to make this happen. Because when does Jesus die? He dies in the late afternoon, about 3-ish p.m. When does the Sabbath begin? Sundown. So between 5:30 and 6:30. So we're talking a very short window of time. Very short window of time. This is one of the reasons that we believe the grave of Joseph of Arimathea is somewhat close to, though I don't necessarily believe it's in the shadow, the cross and the tomb are in the same shadow of each other, because I don't believe a wealthy man would pick a tomb that's right next to a place of execution. So I don't know about you, but I don't want my final resting place to be right next to an electric chair, or a place where lethal injection is being offered. So, but it's at least close enough that they could make the journey in a relatively short amount of time. Now, the preparations that are mentioned here are not extraordinary in the details, except for two things. The first thing that we'll notice is that they're incomplete because they have to do it quickly. The best that they can do is wrap Jesus' body. That's all that they have time for, in a clean linen sheet. There are no spices or oils used on the body, and so that opens the door for the necessity of further long-term burial preparations, which we'll talk to when we get to the resurrection. Yeah, but they did not get the chance to actually put them on at that point because it had to be done quickly. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about just a couple hours. And that also opens the door for why Mary and the other Marys have to get to Jesus so they can actually finish what was started. They brought them, but not necessarily completed because it takes hours to fully prepare a body for long-term burial. It's a lot. Yeah, we'll get to that. It is. Nicodemus is the one that is specifically the one that brings the spices. It sounds as though, if you read all the Gospels together, that the spices were left there, maybe in the tomb, but the body was not yet prepared for long-term burial. The second thing that from a detail standpoint, is that there are witnesses. The women, again, are witnesses here. Here, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, perhaps the wife of Clopas. We're not told which Mary it is, because everybody's name is Mary. We're not told which Mary. Is it Mary, the mother of Jesus, also known as the mother of James and Joseph, or Mary Clopas, or someone else entirely? Best guess, probably Mary, the mother of Jesus. That would be my best guess. Again, that is a guess. But that sets the stage for the tomb scene. Now, there's one more detail that is added to this, is that the grave is made secure first by a stone. The word used to describe it is a great stone. It's a mega stone. Actually, it is, in fact, megos in the Greek. It's the megos. It's a huge, gigantic, weighty stone, and very difficult and large to move. But that is not enough. And so in verse 62, it says this: the next day, that is the day after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember how that impostor said, while he was still alive, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he is risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go make it as secure as you can." So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. Now, this section of the burial is unique to Matthew, and it serves to illustrate a very important point to the early church. What is the point that Matthew wants to make about the grave of Jesus? The secure, which means what? Nobody is taking him out without divine intervention. Matthew wants to make the point. They did everything that could be humanly done to make Jesus secure. He couldn't be stolen. And he actually makes the point of putting those words in the mouths of the religious leaders, because Matthew had probably heard people say, "Well, you know what? You disciples, you actually stole his body." And Matthew wants to say, no. It was not. We didn't steal it. We're cowards, by the way. We didn't even go to the tomb until way after. And even if we had, there would have been no way we could have done anything to steal his body. So, people wanted to the religious leaders wanted to make sure that this could not happen, and so they need Pilate once again. A Roman execution would require a Roman guard. So they are deferential to Pilate, not because they respect Pilate, but because they need Pilate. However, there's still this political back and forth that continues. Pilate tells them they can use the guard that's already assigned to them. The religious leaders had Roman guards already assigned to them to keep the status quo secure. And they have temple guards themselves. This is why when the guards are later called to report about the resurrection, they don't go to Pilate, they go to the chief priests, because it's the guard assigned to the religious leaders that has been that is at the tomb when Jesus is resurrected. So they go back to the people to whom they've been assigned. Now, think about the timing of this. When does Jesus die? What day of the week? Friday. Okay? Relative to the Jewish calendar, why is that important? We've already said it. What's the next day? It's the Sabbath day. It's the Sabbath. They got to get everything done on the Sabbath. The day of preparation for the Sabbath is Friday. You prepare on Friday so that you can rest on Saturday. It's interesting that the religious leaders, it says they go to Pilate when? After the day of preparation, which means what day? They go on Saturday, which is also known as the Sabbath. The religious leaders who spend a ton of time chastising Jesus for doing his work on the Sabbath, what are they doing? They're not just working on the Sabbath. They're engaging in political machinations on the Sabbath. They're going to a Gentile on the Sabbath. They're breaking the Sabbath up one side and down the other. And so some have tried to, some commentators have tried to create alternative solutions because they don't believe that the religious leaders would be so obviously out of bounds and out of step with the law. They tried to reread or eliminate Matthew's obvious timestamp. But what Matthew is doing, I think very intentionally, because again, what is Matthew trying to do? He's trying to make a contrast between the hypocrisy of the religious leaders and the relative faithfulness of those who are on the outside, or those, in this case with Joseph of Arimethea, who are on the inside, but by their association with Jesus are now on the outside. Matthew's making a point that they're hypocrites. They are hypocrites. Because as they have regularly chastised Jesus for doing good works, healing on the Sabbath, now they are doing definitively bad works on the Sabbath. With a Gentile, no less. That's how they like to see it, right? That's right. That's how they like to see it. They get to break them because they make them, or they enforce them, and so they're not going to enforce them on themselves. Now, how would they make the tomb secure? There's a couple of different things, and we'll get into this a little bit more next week. But in addition to the guard, which would have been substantial, they would have added a seal to the tomb. Now, this is not a wax seal like you would think on a letter. That wouldn't be very secure at all. But it's more substantial and would leave no doubt of the tomb, so the security of the tomb. So you have a tomb that has a stone in front of it, and a seal would be across the tomb and secured to the walls opposite the tomb with some sort of a metal spike of some kind. The idea is, as heavy as this tomb is, you've still got to get through the leather and the iron even to get to the heavy stone. And plus you've got these guards, my stick figure guards, standing watch with swords. It's secure. In the first century, that's as secure as you're going to make it. And I got to say, even by 21st century standards, you're going to have a hard time getting in this tomb. You're going to have to bring weapons. You're going to have to bring tools, dynamite, forklift, something. It's going to be loud, it's going to be noisy, and everybody's going to hear it. Much less in the first century when people are watching this tomb. The idea was that if a resurrection occurred, it would have to be miraculous. It would have to be miraculous. Such seals, not exactly like this, but seals of this kind on different style tombs have been noted in ancient Near Eastern cultures. Even in Egypt, some of the pharaohs had seals that were similar in nature to this sort of seal. We're going to pause there because we're getting into the resurrection. Chapter 28, the last chapter in Matthew's Gospel, the last chapter. And it's a much briefer chapter, only 20 verses. Only 20 verses. Any questions? Comments? Great thoughts. For those that don't know, Pastor Mike is preaching in the 10:30 classic service today. First time in 6 years in our pulpit. I think you should do it for a living. I think. Yes, well, I know. I'm preaching on envy as well. He's got more experience with envy than I do, though. Yeah, no. Yeah, trust me, I'm not looking forward to gluttony or lust, for that matter. I'm going to try to figure out a way not to be here those 2 days, but let's pray. Lord God, thank you for the day that you've given us, the blessings and the community. And we're thankful for your word and its impact on our hearts and our minds. Just, Lord, help us to be the kind of people who live with hope, live with peace, live with joy at what you have given us. That because of your life, your death, your resurrection, your ascension, we can have an openness and a communion with you. Move in and through our hearts and minds, we pray in Jesus' name.